Toward the end of 2019, police in Elkhart County, Indiana, alerted the public to be on the lookout for a woman who'd vanished without a trace and was considered at risk of harm. People around the region reacted about the way you'd expect, with an outpouring of concern and by doing what they could to raise awareness. As the police pressed forward for leads, members of the seedy, drug-infested underworld in this corner of small-town America began to come forward with stories that at first appeared too horrible to be believed. As time went on, loved ones of this woman and the community at large were forced to accept the terrible truth that by the time the public had been alerted with a missing persons poster, it had already been too late. Kimberly Dyer was a 31-year-old mother and resident of Columbia City, Indiana. She made ends meet by working 2 jobs as a waitress at a bowling alley and adjacent restaurant. And she exuded care and affection for those around her. So much so that she always seemed to make a lasting impression on acquaintances and coworkers. But several people in her life noticed that in the autumn of 2019, she was starting to hang around dangerous people. Then, in the second week of November that year, the Elkhart County Sheriff's Office put out public notices to be on the lookout for Kimberly, who hadn't been seen or heard from by family members in over 2 weeks. Locals shared the notice hundreds of times on social media and flooded the cops with tips and questions, including whether Kimberly's children were safe. Some people contacted her and urged her to come forward, convinced that she had simply fallen off the radar. To many who knew her, it did not make sense that she would simply vanish, or that she might be a target for violence, as she appeared to live a fairly normal lifestyle that wouldn't obviously place her in harm's way. Few could have known that the end of this mystery would reveal that Kimberly Dyer, the unassuming waitress from Columbia City, had crossed paths with one of the most notorious and well-established gangs in the Midwest. But there was a lot more to Kimberly's disappearance than met the eye. For one thing, the call for tips by the police had essentially been a ruse, which served to make those responsible nervous and more likely to make mistakes than it was to help detectives solve a mystery. For you see, 2 full days before the alert went out, a woman had revealed to homicide investigators something that sounded like an exaggerated horror story. She described brutal torture, admissions of guilt, and finally the disposal of a body that was done in such a way that it left the police almost no chance of finding it on their own. But she'd backed all this up by actually directing the police to an area about 40 minutes northeast of Elkhart, near Constantine, Michigan, to a wooded area and down an embankment where they came across a plastic drum that had been draped with camouflage. And that's where police found the mangled body of Kimberly Dyer, and their first indication that the story that sounded too brutal to be believed might actually be true. In order to explain what had occurred, we're going to have to go back 7 years before Kimberly's disappearance, to the fall of 2012, when a man named Tyler Saunders purchased a house on Old Orchard Avenue. Tyler had every reason to be optimistic about the future. He was recently engaged to be married, and he and his wife were getting ready to own a home that any couple would be pleased with. It was a roughly 25-square-foot, single-story brick house with a large backyard and a spacious basement. It was located at 56659 Old Orchard Lane in Elkhart, in a neighborhood that looked like any other upper-middle-class American suburb, where one might stereotypically expect to find happy families and well-maintained lawns. But by 2019, his marriage had crumbled into divorce proceedings. Wells Fargo Bank was in the process of foreclosing on his home, and the property at 56659 Old Orchard Lane had become known as a safe haven for drug addicts to come get high, maybe spend a few days sleeping on the couch or the floor, and leave or return at their leisure. Tyler, too, had fallen into the cycle of methamphetamine addiction, and now this was his life. Of course, it wasn't just addicts who made themselves at home. The property also became known among drug dealers, too, as a place where they could show up, empty their stock, and leave with a pocket full of cash. Kimberly Dyer, as it turned out, was no stranger to 56659 Old Orchard Lane. Having recently ended a long-term relationship, she was now hanging out with and casually dating a man named Jose Lopez Jr., who went by Capillo, and the two of them would find themselves at the drug house with some regularity. They were far from the only ones, and this relatively small group of folks in Elkhart County soon became well known to each other. They included a woman named Hope Lowry, who would show up there to get high 3 to 4 times per week, and another woman named Ashley Bope, who sometimes brought a binded notebook with her when she showed up at the house. Everyone there shared drug addiction in common, but some were more dangerous than others, including 3 young men who were openly affiliated with the Latin Kings. Gangs have existed in the United States since the 19th century, and there are estimated to be well over 1 million members of gangs nationwide. Most of these groups form organically in neighborhoods, and either fizzle out or are prosecuted into non-existence. The Latin Kings are on the other side of this spectrum, having not just maintained, but continually thrived across the country over their past 5 decades of existence. Formed in Chicago in the 1970s, the Latin Kings are part of what's known as the People's Nation, an alliance of the Latin Kings, Black P. Stones, and Vice Lords, which rival the Gangster Disciples and related Folk Nation, and have engulfed numerous cliques and street crews in the process. The Latin Kings have sprawled across the Midwest to now have a presence in at least 34 states. A recent study of law enforcement agencies reported that 45% of police departments say they deal with the Kings on some level. Because they're so well known, we won't delve into the structure, other than to say that their symbols include a 5-point crown and related hand sign, intended to symbolize their stated values of love, respect, sacrifice, obedience, and honor. Their colors are black and gold, and they're propped up by a massive involvement in drug sales, especially marijuana and cocaine. Rumored to have ties to Colombian and even Nigerian drug rings, as well as Mexican cartels, the Kings are also known to supply themselves with drugs through armed robberies and home invasions. When the Latin Kings became big enough to spread out of Chicago into neighboring areas, the nearby Northwest Indiana community was one of the first places they landed. This is a process known as gang migration, which we've seen not just with the Latin Kings, Gangster Disciples, and other Chicago-based gangs, but with almost every group that has formed in a well-populated area and gained nationwide notice, like the Bloods and Crips of California, or even the New York City Mafia. This process of gang migration can happen organically, such as when gang members are priced out of an area by changes in housing markets, or it can be a deliberate attempt by the gang to open up new markets and take over new regions. When the Latin Kings touched down in Indiana, it set off violence and bloodshed with rivals that quickly caught the attention of the Justice Department. On February 25th, 2007, for instance, 2 leaders of the rival Latin Dragons, named James Walsh and Gonzalo Diaz, were murdered outside the Sopranos Lounge in Griffith, Indiana, by Latin Kings members. And the Kings later greenlit one of their own members believed to be telling authorities about the double homicide. In the early 2010s, 2 Latin King leaders, or Incas, named Robert Nieto and Derek Valladolid, were tried and convicted of involvement in 2 murders, including the shooting death of 16-year-old Victor Lazinski, and a home invasion robbery where the victim's neighbor was gunned down. This prosecution was based on the theory that Nieto and Valladolid were in charge of 2 Indiana-based chapters of the Latin Kings, and were acting in the gang's interest. Nieto allegedly shot Lazinski on the belief that he was a rival. But the 3 Latin Kings who hung out on Old Orchard Lane were much younger than any of the gang members we've just mentioned. Their names were Matthew Merzinski, who was 22 at the time, Donald Owen, who was 20, and Mario Angulo, who was only 19. Of the 3, Owen was seen as a leader, and he proudly displayed signs of gang membership on his face and neck, with LK tattoos and the crown symbol that would make his status obvious to anyone even vaguely familiar with the gang. He called himself King Duke, and as we'll see, the other 2 took his input seriously. In fact, on either October 21st or 22nd, Angulo called Owen on the phone and beckoned him to come down to the Old Orchard Lane home immediately. Owen wanted to know why, but Angelo would only tell him things were getting serious. Quote, "I wish I could tell you, but I can't. I need your help." Owen left his home with a woman named Jennifer Kufelt, not knowing exactly what he was getting into, but when he found out, he didn't flinch. The trouble had actually started several days earlier, when Kimberly Dyer had confided in Jose Lopez Jr. that she had something she needed to show him. When he showed an interest, she revealed that she'd taken the notebook that Ashley Bope had been known to bring to the home. Inside was a list of names and a chart that appeared to be a drawing of the old Orchard Lane property's layout. To anyone who looked at it, it appeared to be a strong indicator that whoever made this list had done so with the intent of sharing it with law enforcement, who'd obviously be interested in a home where drugs were freely used and sold. For reasons not known, Kimberly hung on to the notebook, and one day, in the third week of October, Matthew Merzinski found it and naturally assumed it was Kimberly's. Both he and Mario Angulo flew into a rage, accusing Kimberly of being a cop, and Merzinski blamed her for his brother being in prison. When she denied ownership of the book and others backed her up on this, Mario and Merzinski were unfazed. They forced Kimberly into the basement, duct taped her, and began what they referred to as an interrogation, but more resembled a torture chamber. The pair waterboarded her, shaved her head, zip-tied her, and subjected her to physical punishment so far beyond the pale that it serves no purpose to describe in detail. Others in the home listened from above in horror, except for a man named Robert Porter, who volunteered to guard Kimberly with a rifle while the others decided her fate. Porter was a drug dealer who'd sold marijuana to people in the home that day, left to re-up in Michigan, then returned with more pot to sell. Now, he was putting himself in the center of an escalating situation, and it blew up in his face fast. At some point, the group heard Kimberly screaming and accusing Porter of sexually assaulting her, and because of this, the others turned on Porter too. He was zip-tied next to Kimberly. They threatened him with death, forced him to eat dog food and crawl into a dog cage, and only freed hours later when one of them used a blowtorch to remove the zip ties from his wrists. At some point during this horrifying ordeal, Owen was called in as more or less a consultant. He had hardly crossed the threshold when he noticed a ring Porter was wearing, stating, "Oh, I gotta get paid," beat Porter up and took it. Owen was wearing a bandana when he entered the basement, but took it off after he decided that Kimberly wasn't going to live long enough to identify him to police. Witnesses would later tell police that Angulo used a broken bottle to fatally stab Kimberly. But a pathologist named Dr. Elizabeth Douglas would later list 3 equally valid possible causes of death and 83 distinct injuries. At any rate, Angulo was apparently acting on the orders of Owen, who told him, quote, "Put her to sleep," before the group forced Porter to record a taped confession on video and let him go with the promise that he would never reveal what he'd seen. On his way out, Owen stabbed him with a 12-inch knife. Jennifer Kufelt, the woman who arrived at the home with Owen, helped the group dispose of Kimberly's body, but Kufelt wasn't exactly on board with everything that had happened. And as it turned out, neither were most of the people present that day, even if they'd all failed to stop it from happening. Days later, Jose Lopez Jr. was arrested on an unrelated probation violation and quickly started talking. He told Lieutenant Michael Karich of the Elkhart County Homicide Unit that he had information on a murder that wasn't even on police's radar, and floated Jennifer's name as a possible witness. The cops served a warrant and brought her in for questioning, and she willingly took them to Michigan and showed them the location of the body, which prosecutors say they would have never found without her help. Another woman came forward. Her name was Jerica DeLater Foster, and she was the surrogate mother of Mario Angulo. She told police he'd come to her after the murder because he had, quote, "fucked up," and desperately needed help covering up the crime. She said she was shocked and dumbfounded as he casually described what had taken place, but that she'd at least held out a bit of hope for what humanity was left in him. When she told him that the notebook wasn't Kimberly's and that they'd killed her for nothing, hoping for a glimpse of remorse, he'd coldly responded, quote, "She won't be missed." As it turned out, those words would come back to haunt Mario during his murder trial 2 years later. Porter, DeLater Foster, Saunders, Lopez, and others who were there that day all testified, and the defense sought to blame the entire thing on Porter. He was easily the weakest witness, in part due to the fact that he admitted to helping strangle Kimberly at one point, but claimed it was under duress. The defense also attempted to throw a curveball into the trial by revealing that Porter had been questioned in the similar, still unsolved disappearance of a young woman named Brittany Schenk. But prosecutors convinced the court that it was a needless, irrelevant distraction, and that Porter was one of numerous people to be questioned in that sprawling investigation. At trial, the prosecutors called it a gang crime, stating that the perception of Kimberly being a snitch, while false, represented a cardinal sin and threat to the existence of the Latin kings in the area. But the murder of Kimberly Dyer was nothing like most gang crimes. In each of the cases we described in other parts of Indiana involving the Latin kings, the suspects acted quickly, with clear intent to eliminate rivals, for specific reasons. By contrast, this murder was something of a meth-addled thrill kill, committed by people who seemed to revel in the control they exerted at Old Orchard Lane that day. But if prosecutors would have had any trouble proving gang allegations to a jury, that was all quashed by the following ridiculous fact. After returning to the home, burning carpet, painting blood spatter off the walls, and burning evidence in a backyard fire pit, the group filled the walls of the basement where it all went down with gang graffiti, with Owen going so far as to actually take his moniker, King Duke, on walls that they just finished cleaning in order to avoid getting caught. Merzinski avoided a murder charge, but received more than 60 years in prison. Angiulo, in part because of his young age, was sentenced to more than a century behind bars. And Owen, for playing a leadership role in what had transpired, was given the harshest term, life without possibility of parole. Before sentencing, a call for mercy came out in court, not from who you might expect. It was Kimberly Dyer's mother who begged Judge Michael A. Cristofino not to give Owen life, holding steadfast in the belief that it was wrong because he didn't personally kill Kimberly. As she spoke, Owen began to cry. Then he had this to say: "I truly apologize for the events that took place, and I'm sorry I didn't stop what was going on." But he added that he was still innocent and, quote, never touched her. He and Mario Angiulo's appeals have been unsuccessful. Both men remain behind bars.
I'm glad they did their job, and I'm glad somebody is paying for it so that the family could have peace. But there's really not a peace that you can have with this one. This one was hard because it really took a good person from the earth. Kim was a great person.